A first-class passenger makes racist remarks to a casually dressed black man as he takes his seat beside her. Hours later, her jaw drops when she sees him step into the cockpit. Before we go on, I'm curious. Where in the world are you watching from? I'd love to know now. The boarding gate was bustling, and the air seemed charged with the usual anticipation and mild tension of a full flight. People juggled their carry-ons, wrestled with oversized coffee cups, and checked their phones. Among the passengers was Tom Johnson, a man in his late 40s, dressed simply in dark jeans, a casual button-down shirt, and a jacket thrown over his shoulder. He moved through the gate with calm confidence, barely noticeable in the crowd, yet there was something about his measured steps and self-assured presence that stood out. A few steps behind him, a woman in her mid-50s swept forward, her presence anything but subtle. Laura wore a crisp white blouse, a fitted blazer, and the unmistakable air of someone used to being accommodated. Her hair was styled in neat waves, her earrings glinted in the harsh airport lights, and her lips were set in a faintly disapproving line as she surveyed the crowd around her. As she approached the boarding line, her eyes landed on the man ahead of her. Something in her gaze hardened. Laura observed him with a mix of disapproval and unease, though there was no apparent reason for her disdain. Tom hadn't even noticed her. He was focused on pulling out his boarding pass and maneuvering his carry-on down the narrow boarding bridge. Inside the plane, he found his seat easily and stowed his bag in the overhead compartment above his row. He took a seat by the window, adjusted himself comfortably, and looked out over the tarmac as the ground crew prepared for takeoff. Laura, however, was seated a row behind him. Her face soured as she noticed his presence so close to her own seat. She glanced at the seat next to him, then at the overhead bin above them, as if finding some invisible fault in the man's mere presence. "Excuse me," she said, her tone cool, but edged with something sharper. She leaned toward him, her voice louder than necessary. "Are you sure that's your seat?" Tom looked up, meeting her gaze with calm, steady eyes. "Yes, ma'am. This is my seat." His voice was polite, his words simple and direct. She gave a tight, insincere smile. Her eyes drifted to his carry-on above, as if it were somehow offensive. "I thought you might be mistaken. It's very crowded up there." He didn't answer, simply offering a polite nod before turning back to his window. But that seemed to only annoy her further. She stood there for a moment longer, hands on her hips, before sighing dramatically and taking her own seat behind him. Her movements exaggerated enough to draw the attention of other nearby passengers. As she sat, she continued to fidget, casting glances in his direction. It wasn't long before she leaned over the armrest, addressing him once more. "I noticed your bag is taking up quite a bit of room. I have a fragile item here, and I need to be sure it's secure. Perhaps you should move yours further down." Tom turned again, his expression unchanging. "My bag is stowed safely, ma'am. I'm sure there's space in the overhead bins just a few rows back." His words were calm, not unkind, but there was a firmness in his tone that implied he wouldn't be moved. Laura narrowed her eyes, looking as if she might say something more, but instead, she sank back into her seat with a huff. She tapped her nails on the tray table, looking pointedly toward the nearest flight attendant, who was currently busy helping an elderly woman a few rows ahead. As the plane filled up, the other passengers settled into their seats, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard and announcing the upcoming flight time. But there was still an air of tension in the row where they sat. The woman's irritation was obvious. Finally, the flight attendant made her way to their row, and Laura wasted no time in catching her attention. "Excuse me," she said in the same loud, assertive voice. She pointed toward Tom's overhead bag with a perfectly manicured finger. "That bag is taking up a lot of space, don't you think? I'm concerned about my own belongings. Would you mind checking to see if it's properly stowed?" The attendant looked between the two passengers, visibly uncertain. "Ma'am, all bags are checked before takeoff to make sure they're secure. I assure you, everything is fine." But Laura's face showed no sign of relenting. "Well, I'd feel a lot better if someone could double-check," she said, her voice firm with the entitlement of someone who expected her demands to be met without question. The attendant shot a quick, apologetic glance at Tom, then turned back to Laura with a smile that was a touch more forced than before. I'll make a note of it, ma'am, but for now, we are focusing on getting everyone seated and preparing for takeoff. Please try to relax. Laura gave a tight smile, clearly dissatisfied, but the flight attendant turned away before she could argue further. She leaned back and continued to glance at Tom as if he were somehow responsible for her unease. Tom said nothing, simply keeping his gaze fixed out the window, but there was a subtle tension in his shoulders that hinted he was aware of her discomfort and of the looks others were giving him because of it. As the engines roared to life and the plane began to taxi toward the runway, she muttered under her breath, loud enough for him and nearby passengers to hear, "They'll just let anyone fly these days, won't they?" The plane leveled off smoothly as they reached cruising altitude, and the faint hum of the engines filled the cabin. Passengers settled into the monotony of the flight, some turning on their screens, others pulling out books or simply dozing off. But not her. She shifted restlessly in her seat, stealing frequent glances at the man a row ahead. Her jaw was set, her lips pursed tightly, and each time she looked his way, her frown deepened, as though his very presence were an affront. After a moment, she leaned forward, pressing her manicured fingers against the back of his seat. "Excuse me," she said sharply, tapping on the headrest with an edge of impatience. He turned slowly, catching the glint of hostility in her eyes. His expression remained calm, unruffled. "Yes," he replied, voice low and polite. She smiled tightly, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Are you sure you're in the right seat? I mean, this is business class after all." The question hung in the air, the implication as clear as glass. A few nearby passengers turned their heads slightly, pretending not to listen but clearly taking in every word. Tom's face betrayed no reaction, his composure unbroken. "Yes, I'm sure," he replied, his tone neutral but steady. "Seat 4A. I checked before I sat down." "Ah," she responded with a barely concealed smirk, as if something had been confirmed in her mind. "Well, you never know these days. It's not uncommon for people to try to upgrade themselves without permission." Tom's gaze didn't waver, though something in his eyes hardened. There was a weight behind his look, something calm yet unyielding. "Don't worry, ma'am. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," he said softly, a subtle edge in his tone that seemed to surprise her. Laura scoffed, shifted in her seat, and crossed her arms with a huff. But she couldn't seem to leave it alone. Her voice rose again, just loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "It's not about where you think you're supposed to be," she muttered, more to herself than to him, but still loud enough for him to hear her. "It's about following rules. People these days think they're entitled to just move up in the world without earning it." The quiet stir of murmurs began among the other passengers. A man a few seats back glanced over, eyes narrowing slightly at her pointed words, while a young woman in the row across shifted uncomfortably. The mood in the cabin shifted, a subtle tension beginning to fill the air. Tom's jaw clenched briefly, though he quickly released it, taking a deep, calming breath. He turned away, choosing not to respond. But silence, as it turned out, only seemed to provoke her further. "You know," she continued, her voice still low, but now filled with a kind of condescension, "it's really just a matter of courtesy, knowing where you belong and not infringing on others. People worked hard to be in this part of the plane, after all." Her words hung in the air, sharp as broken glass, and this time the man turned fully to face her. For a moment, he said nothing, simply meeting her gaze, his eyes calm and steady. "Ma'am," he said softly, a hint of restrained power in his voice, "I don't think we need to have this conversation. I'm here to enjoy my flight, just like everyone else." The response seemed to catch her off guard. Her face flushed slightly, her composure cracking as she opened her mouth, then closed it again. But after a second, her lips curved into a thin smile. "Oh, I'm sure you're here to enjoy it," she sneered, folding her arms. "I just hope you understand that people in this section expect a certain standard." At this, the young woman across the aisle rolled her eyes, whispering to her companion. The man next to her shook his head, exchanging a quick glance with the man seated in front of him, as if to share in the unspoken disapproval. Yet the woman seemed oblivious, or perhaps convinced by her own assumptions. Her gaze flicked pointedly toward his carry-on bag, and her lips pursed. "I suppose it would be polite to let the staff know if there's a problem," she announced, as if speaking to herself, but clearly directed at him. Tom, keeping his composure, looked away, his expression unchanged. But now, the other passengers were beginning to murmur, casting uneasy glances at the woman as she continued her subtle tirade. Finally, she pressed the flight attendant call button with a single dramatic poke. The attendant arrived moments later, smiling professionally but with a slightly wary glance at the woman. "Yes, ma'am? Is everything all right?" Laura looked up with a stiff, practiced smile. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm just a bit concerned. You see, this gentleman's bag here," she gestured at the overhead bin where his carry-on was stored. "It is quite large, and I think it may be violating space limits. I've also noticed he's been restless. I don't mean to pry, of course, but with the way things are these days, I think we'd all feel more comfortable if his bag was properly checked." The flight attendant hesitated, glancing between her and the man. "Ma'am, all carry-ons have already been checked to make sure they fit within the space requirements. If you're concerned about your own belongings, we can always make an adjustment." But Laura's smile remained rigid. "Oh, I don't think I'm the only one concerned," she said, her voice now louder, enough to be heard several rows away. "It's just that some people need reminding that there are certain standards on a flight like this." The attendant glanced over at the man, her expression a mixture of apology and unease. She gave him a small, sympathetic nod before turning back to the woman. "I'll make sure everything is secure, ma'am," she said diplomatically. "But please try to relax. We're here to ensure everyone's comfort." Laura's lips tightened as she leaned back, clearly unsatisfied, but willing to wait. Her fingers drummed on the armrest, as if she were calculating her next move. The flight attendant gave Tom an apologetic glance as she adjusted his bag slightly, muttering a soft, "Sorry about this," under her breath. He nodded, giving her a polite smile, but it was clear that the woman wasn't about to let the issue drop. The tension in the cabin grew thicker, and now it seemed the other passengers were taking sides, either glancing at the man with quiet sympathy or exchanging looks of disapproval toward Laura. It was unspoken, yet obvious. An invisible line had been crossed, and they all felt it. As the flight progressed, Laura's eyes stayed fixed on the overhead bin, as though expecting the man's carry-on to somehow offend her further. With a sudden, exaggerated sigh, she leaned over her seat again, pressing the flight attendant button sharply. The same flight attendant returned, her smile a bit more strained than before. "Yes, ma'am, is there something I can help you with?" Laura pointed again to the man's bag, this time with a tone that left little room for doubt or negotiation. "I'm sorry, but I can't just sit here and pretend that everything is fine. I've been uncomfortable since takeoff, and frankly, I think everyone else here deserves to feel safe too." The attendant's brow furrowed, visibly taken aback. "Ma'am, is there a specific concern you have?" "Yes, I'd like his bag thoroughly checked," she said, her voice rising. "No offense," she added with a hollow smile in the man's direction. "But these days you can never be too sure what people might be carrying. After all, anyone can be on these flights." This time, there was no hiding it. Her tone carried an unmistakable fact, a deeply unsettling insinuation that lingered in the air like the aftermath of a slap. Around them, the passengers had gone still, some of their heads turning slightly, eyes wide with increased curiosity. Tom clenched his jaw briefly, but took a deep breath, keeping his gaze on the seat in front of him. His silence spoke louder than words, an act of restraint that only seemed to frustrate Laura further. "Ma'am," the flight attendant said, clearly struggling to remain calm, "we checked all carry-ons at the gate and during boarding. I assure you, we wouldn't allow anything on board that might be unsafe." Laura huffed, crossing her arms. "That's not enough. It would be irresponsible not to double-check. How do we know he didn't just slip something in afterward? I saw him fidgeting around earlier." She gave the man a pointed look, as if daring him to deny it. The attendant looked helplessly between them, her eyes pleading with Tom to bear with it for just a little longer. "Ma'am, please try to relax. I understand your concern, but we need to keep the aisles clear, and I'm sure this passenger is just as eager for a peaceful flight as you are." "Oh, I'm sure he is," Laura replied with a sneer. But if he has nothing to hide, he won't mind a quick check, right? Tom finally reached his breaking point. He looked up and met her gaze directly. His expression was calm, but there was a quiet authority in his eyes, a depth of experience and strength that made her blink in surprise. "Ma'am," he said, his tone cool and controlled, "I've done nothing to make you feel unsafe, but your behavior is starting to make everyone around you uncomfortable." A murmur ran through the rows behind them, the soft sound of passengers murmuring in agreement. One or two people nodded subtly in his direction, their gazes filled with encouragement. But Laura's face reddened, her lips twisting in indignation. "Excuse me? How dare you accuse me of making others uncomfortable? I'm simply concerned for everyone's safety, and I have every right to feel safe on this plane. If that requires making sure your belongings are properly inspected, then so be it." Her voice grew louder, and now it was impossible for anyone nearby to ignore. The woman across the aisle, who had been watching quietly, sighed and leaned toward the man, whispering, "Some people just don't know when to stop. You're handling this well." Another woman beside him looked visibly annoyed, crossing her arms and casting daggers with her eyes at Laura. "Ridiculous," she muttered under her breath. But Laura, fueled by her own outrage and now the apparent backing of the flight attendant's politeness, pressed forward. "I'd like to speak to the captain," she demanded, her voice quivering with manufactured urgency. "I won't sit here and be treated this way when I'm only looking out for everyone's welfare." The attendant swallowed, clearly uneasy, but nodded. "I'll let the captain know of your concern, ma'am. Please give me just a moment." She quickly walked toward the front of the plane, leaving an uncomfortable silence in her wake. As they waited, the woman tapped her fingers impatiently, as if sure she'd be validated in her request. A faint, smug smile played on her lips, a look of satisfaction that left no question of her intent. Tom stared straight ahead, his face expressionless, but there was a tension in his posture, a quiet endurance that seemed to make the nearby passengers more sympathetic with each passing moment. After a few minutes, the flight attendant returned, visibly uncomfortable. She leaned down and spoke softly, choosing her words carefully. "Ma'am, I've spoken to the captain, and he's asked that we all remain seated and respect the space of our fellow passengers. We can assure you that everything has been checked and is safe." Laura's face turned scarlet. "So you're refusing to even investigate?" Her voice shook, not with fear, but with anger. "I'll have you know I have friends in very high places. When I get off this plane, I'll be speaking with your superiors about this disregard for safety." She gave the man a scathing look. "It's unbelievable what people are allowed to get away with these days." The flight attendant, her patience clearly wearing thin, gave her a small nod. "I understand, ma'am, and I'm sorry for any distress. But as the captain said, please remain seated and try to enjoy the remainder of the flight." Laura scoffed, crossing her arms and muttering loud enough for several rows to hear. "Enjoy it? Not likely, not with people who think they're entitled to everything." Tom's patience, however, remained intact. He closed his eyes, took a breath, and let the words slide off him, a calmness that seemed to unsettle the woman more than any angry reaction could have. Around him, a few passengers cast sympathetic glances his way, some shaking their heads at the woman's entitlement. The young woman across the aisle met his gaze and gave him a small, supportive nod. He offered a polite nod, a faint smile of gratitude, but still, he remained silent, choosing not to engage. Laura, however, was less restrained. Leaning forward slightly, she addressed the woman in a voice just loud enough for others to hear. "You know, I think you're the one making the rest of us feel unsafe with all this unnecessary drama. Maybe you should sit back and think about that." Laura's mouth opened, and for a moment her face twisted with outrage, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. She huffed, crossing her arms tightly and muttering something under her breath. For the first time since the confrontation began, the man looked around, catching the eyes of the few passengers who had shown support. He acknowledged them with a subtle nod, his expression calm and resolute. There was a hint of something in his eyes now, a silent acknowledgement, a quiet resilience that said he'd been through worse, and this woman's hostility, as unnerving as it was, wouldn't shake him. Laura fumed in silence, clearly rattled, but unwilling to let it go. She shifted in her seat, unable to meet the eyes of those around her. But the smugness in her posture had faded, replaced by a defensive discomfort. Just as the cabin returned to an uneasy silence, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom with a carefully worded message, directed at everyone but feeling like it was meant just for her. Ladies and gentlemen, I kindly remind you that respect and patience are expected from all passengers. Let's make this a pleasant journey for everyone on board. The cabin fell silent as the captain's words lingered in the air. Even the hum of the engines seemed muted, as though the entire plane were holding its breath. Passengers exchanged subtle, knowing looks, the tension obvious as everyone seemed to silently question how the woman would react. Laura's face turned a deeper shade of red, and her jaw clenched as she straightened up in her seat. Her gaze darted around, registering the growing looks of disapproval. People had started leaning over to whisper to one another, and it was clear to her that they were talking about her. The frustration and indignation in her eyes sharpened, but her shoulders stiffened in defiance. She glanced toward the man again, and a cold resentment flared in her expression. As if sensing her gaze, he looked back, his face calm but with a quiet strength that seemed to unsettle her. He held her gaze just long enough to make her shift in her seat, visibly flustered. A young couple 2 rows ahead leaned closer, the woman whispering to her partner, "Unbelievable. I can't believe she's still at it." Another passenger, a middle-aged man across the aisle, let out a low sigh of exasperation, his voice carrying just loud enough. Some people just don't know when to quit. The woman's expression hardened, her eyes flashing with a defiance that bordered on desperation. She lifted her chin, her voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Excuse me, but I am entitled to speak up if I feel something isn't right," she said, her tone indignant, clearly addressing the murmuring passengers. "I'm only doing what anyone else would do to keep everyone safe." A few passengers rolled their eyes or looked away, their expressions making it clear they weren't buying her excuse. But Laura remained unfazed, her hands clenched on the armrests as she continued to glare at the man, as though hoping he might finally react, finally give her the confrontation she seemed to crave. But he stayed silent, his calmness only frustrating her more. The young woman across the aisle, who had previously shown support, couldn't contain herself any longer. She turned fully toward the woman, her tone respectful but pointed. "Ma'am, I think we're all feeling perfectly safe here. The only person who seems uncomfortable is you." The woman's head whipped around, her expression a mixture of shock and indignation. "I beg your pardon?" she snapped, her voice sharper now, her composure beginning to crack. The young woman met her gaze, unfazed. "With all due respect, you've been making a scene before we even left the ground. It's obvious you're targeting him, and frankly, it's uncomfortable for everyone around you." A murmur of agreement passed through the nearby rows. The woman's face turned pale as the reality of the situation hit her. She was no longer in control. She had become the center of a spectacle, and the sympathy she might have expected was nowhere to be found. Still, she wasn't about to back down. She lifted her chin higher, the defiance flaring once more in her eyes. "Well, maybe some people here don't care about safety, but I do," she said, her voice louder, as though trying to reassert her dominance. She looked directly at the man again, a faint sneer twisting her lips. "You can sit there acting high and mighty, but that doesn't change the fact that we all have standards on flights like these." This time, her words seemed to cross an invisible line. The passengers fell silent, and the air grew colder, thick with the weight of her comment. The young woman who'd spoken up exchanged a look with the man across the aisle, who shook his head in quiet disbelief. Tom took a long, steady breath. For a moment, he closed his eyes, as if steadying himself, and when he looked back at her, his expression was calm but resolute. "Ma'am," he began, his voice low but carrying a weight that made her blink. "I think you've made your point quite clear. Now, I'd appreciate it if you could let me, and everyone else on this plane, enjoy the rest of the flight." His tone was so measured, so composed, that it silenced her more effectively than any outburst could have. It was as though he were drawing a line, one that she had already crossed. Around them, passengers nodded in silent agreement, their sympathy now fully aligned with him. But rather than stopping, the woman only seemed to double down, her voice tight with frustration. "Oh, enjoy the flight? That's easy for you to say. she spat. "I'm the one who's been made to feel uncomfortable this whole time." The woman across the aisle let out a low laugh, clearly done with trying to hold back. "Unbelievable," she muttered, her eyes wide with incredulity. Finally, an older man a few rows back spoke up, his voice calm but carrying a tone of authority. "Ma'am, I think we've all had enough of this. We're all trying to have a peaceful flight, and frankly, you're making that impossible." The woman's face flushed even deeper, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled for a response. But this time, there was no sympathy in the surrounding faces, no silent agreement. She was alone in her outrage, her composure cracking as the reality sank in. For a long, tense moment, she glared around at the faces turned toward her, at the silent disapproval in their eyes. Her hands clenched tightly on the armrests, and her lips pressed together in a thin, angry line. Her world, her perception of control and entitlement, seemed to be slipping out from under her. Tom remained silent, his posture relaxed but dignified, as if he had weathered this storm before. His gaze didn't waver, but there was a quiet strength in it, a resilience that needed no words. Finally, she sank back into her seat, her expression tight, her hands trembling faintly as she crossed her arms and looked out the window, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. For a brief moment, there was silence. The tension lingered, thick and uneasy, as everyone seemed to process what had just happened. Then, slowly, Tom turned his gaze back to the window, his calm demeanor unshaken. The other passengers, visibly relieved, began to settle down, the cabin returning to an uneasy peace. Some glanced at him with nods of respect, and a few exchanged quiet words of approval, their faces clearly showing whose side they had taken. As the tension in the cabin eased and the passengers resumed their activities, Tom leaned back in his seat, his face unreadable. But those who had been watching closely could see something shift in his expression, a hint of quiet resolve, as though he had made a decision. And the woman, visibly rattled, still hadn't realized who she had been targeting. The flight continued, but the cabin felt different now. A lingering tension simmered just beneath the surface, like an aftershock waiting to ripple through the passengers again at any moment. Though everyone had returned to their screens, books, and conversations, the glances cast toward the woman and the man were unmistakable. Laura sat rigidly in her seat, staring out the window as if she could erase the memory of what had just happened by sheer force of will. She could still feel the eyes on her, the silent judgments lingering around her like an invisible weight, pressing down on her shoulders. Her mind churned, her thoughts a flurry of indignation. How dare they turn against her? She was only doing what any responsible person would do, right? In her mind, she was the victim, misunderstood and unfairly judged by the people around her. She had always prided herself on her social awareness, on her ability to read people. But somehow these strangers, the man in front of her, the passengers, even the flight attendant, had all failed to see things her way. The thought infuriated her. Meanwhile, Tom sat quietly, his gaze drifting toward the clouds outside the window, though his expression remained contemplative. He could feel the residual tension in the cabin, aware that others were watching him, silently supporting him. His calm, dignified response hadn't gone unnoticed, and that was what lingered in the air now, a quiet respect. For a brief moment he closed his eyes, letting the memories of past encounters surface in his mind. He'd faced situations like this before, moments when people only saw the color of his skin, jumping to conclusions without ever really seeing him. Early in his career, he had learned to handle moments of prejudice and hostility with grace, knowing that dignity was his shield, his way of rising above their assumptions. The silence brought him back to his youth, to lessons his mother had drilled into him. Her voice echoed in his mind, reminding him of who he was and the legacy he carried. "Never let them take your dignity," she would say. "When people show you disrespect, show them how wrong they are with your grace." He'd taken those words to heart, carrying them like a shield into every boardroom, every negotiation, every encounter that challenged him. And now, on this plane, he felt that quiet strength rising within him again. A few rows back, the young woman who had spoken up before watched him, a look of admiration in her eyes. She glanced at her partner, whispering, "You can tell he's someone important." The way he carries himself, she has no idea who she's dealing with. Her partner nodded in agreement, casting a disapproving glance at the woman by the window. She's going to regret this, he murmured. You can't treat people like that and expect no consequences. The murmurs around the cabin grew quiet as people returned to their own worlds, but the feeling lingered. Unseen by the woman, a ripple of support and sympathy for the man had spread through the plane, a silent solidarity born from shared disapproval of her actions. As the flight attendants moved through the aisles, refilling drinks and tidying trays, the man's calm manners began to put everyone at ease, reassuring them that he wasn't rattled by her behavior. He'd seen it before and handled it with a level of poise that commanded respect. But Laura, stewing in her own sense of indignation, seemed oblivious to the shift around her. She remained fixated on her interpretation of the events, convinced she was justified. She could hardly wait to get off this plane and write a complaint, confident that she would be heard and validated. People like her were always heard after all. They were respected, listened to, taken seriously, but that confidence had started to crack. She could feel the glances from the other passengers, could sense the quiet judgment that had replaced any initial sympathy, and it nagged at her. For the first time, a sliver of doubt crept into her mind, but she quickly brushed it aside. She glanced over at the man again, narrowing her eyes as though trying to assess him anew. His expression was calm, his posture relaxed, but something about his quiet, unshaken dignity unnerved her. She couldn't quite place it, but there was an unmistakable presence about him, a strength that went beyond words. He met her gaze briefly, offering a faint nod, not of submission, but of calm acknowledgement. The gesture was so subtle, yet it held an unspoken power that made her shift uncomfortably in her seat. What had she missed? As if on cue, the flight attendant approached again, this time with a subtle look of recognition and respect. She leaned down toward the man, speaking softly but clearly. "Sir, the captain would like a word with you in the front. He sends his respects." The flight attendant's respectful tone as she addressed the man created a ripple of curiosity throughout the cabin. Passengers glanced up from their screens and books, their attention piqued as they watched the exchange unfold. "Sir, if you'd like to follow me, the captain would be honored to speak with you in the front," the attendant repeated, her voice carrying an undertone of warmth and respect. The woman across the aisle exchanged a knowing glance with her partner, her eyebrows raised as if to say, "I knew it." A few others leaned forward slightly, trying to get a better look at the man, their expressions reflecting growing intrigue. But it was Laura who reacted most visibly, her face twisting in a mixture of confusion and resentment. She let out a scoff, loud enough for several rows to hear. "Oh, please," she muttered, her voice dripping with condescension. "The captain wants to talk to him." Tom, however, ignored her completely. He rose from his seat with a quiet dignity, adjusting his jacket as he stepped into the aisle. His posture was relaxed, exuding a natural authority that made people sit up straighter, as though responding instinctively to his presence. As he followed the attendant toward the front of the plane, the woman's frustration boiled over. She leaned into the aisle, raising her voice slightly, as if addressing the entire cabin. "I don't understand why everyone's fawning over him. I'm the one who felt threatened, and suddenly he's treated like some kind of VIP?" She scoffed again, shaking her head in disbelief. The young woman across the aisle couldn't stay silent any longer. She turned to face the woman directly, her eyes flashing with controlled anger. "You know, maybe if you hadn't been so busy judging him, you'd have noticed he was someone worth respecting from the start." Laura's face turned a deep shade of red, but she quickly brushed off the comment, rolling her eyes. "Respect? I think people throw that word around too loosely these days. Some of us actually have to earn it." But her words fell flat, the silence that followed amplifying her isolation. The passengers around her exchanged looks of disbelief and disapproval, their expressions making it clear that her behavior had gone beyond acceptable boundaries. At the front of the plane, the flight attendant knocked lightly on the cockpit door, which opened to reveal the captain. Tom extended a hand, and the captain took it with both of his, offering a warm, respectful smile. "Thank you for taking a moment," the captain said, his voice carrying a deep sense of admiration. It's truly an honor, sir. We don't often have someone of your caliber on board. Tom inclined his head with a polite smile. The honor is mine, Captain. I appreciate the warm welcome. Their exchange was quiet, but just audible enough for a few passengers nearby to overhear, their eyes widening as they registered the respect and deference in the captain's tone. The woman's curiosity finally got the better of her. She strained her neck, trying to catch a glimpse of the interaction at the front, her brow furrowing in confusion. Why was the crew showing him such deference? And why did the captain look at him with such respect? Back in her seat, she fumed silently, trying to rationalize the situation. Maybe he's some kind of businessman, she thought dismissively, though the answer felt unsatisfying, incomplete. Moments later, Tom returned to his seat, nodding politely at the flight attendant as she thanked him again for his time. He settled back in, his expression calm, though there was now an unmistakable aura around him, a quiet strength and dignity that seemed to radiate outward, filling the cabin with a subdued intensity. The passengers around him straightened in their seats, a new awareness in their gazes. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with respect, but all of them seemed to sense they were in the presence of someone significant. Laura couldn't contain herself any longer. She leaned forward, her voice sharp and impatient. "Well, are we supposed to be impressed by that little show?" She let out a harsh laugh, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. "Is this where you tell us you're someone important?" Tom turned slowly to face her, his expression unchanging, his calm gaze meeting her defiant stare with a quiet power that made her shift in her seat. "I don't believe I owe you an explanation, ma'am," he said, his voice steady, "but I would suggest you think carefully before making assumptions about people you don't know." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time, her confidence faltered, her gaze dropping as his words settled over her, carrying the weight of unspoken authority. The young woman across the aisle chimed in, her voice low but firm. "You know, it's about time someone reminded you that respect goes both ways." Several nearby passengers nodded in agreement, their silent solidarity creating a new pressure that seemed to close in on Laura, isolating her in a way she hadn't anticipated. She tried to rally herself, straightening in her seat, forcing a tight smile. "Well, excuse me for wanting a safe flight," she muttered, though her voice held none of its previous conviction. Her bravado was slipping, piece by piece. Tom remained silent, his gaze returning to the window, as if dismissing her entirely. The rest of the cabin followed suit, turning away from her, their expressions making it clear that her outburst had only cemented their disapproval. Laura crossed her arms tightly, her fingers digging into her sleeves as she stared straight ahead, her face flushed. She could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her, stripping away the confidence she'd worn like armor. As the plane flew on, a sense of finality seemed to settle over the cabin. The passengers had chosen their side, their silent support for the man and a collective stance against her behavior. She sat alone in her indignation, each passing moment deepening her isolation. Just as the cabin settled into silence once more, the flight attendant appeared again, this time holding a small, leather-bound book. She offered it to Tom with a respectful nod. "Sir, would you mind signing this for the captain and crew? They'd be honored to have a memento from someone of your position." The flight attendant's appearance with the leather-bound book drew the attention of every passenger nearby, their eyes widening as they recognized the gesture. This wasn't something offered to just anyone. She held the book out with both hands, her demeanor respectful and slightly awestruck. "Sir, the captain and crew would be honored if you would sign this. They've asked if you'd consider leaving a message as a keepsake." Tom offered a small, gracious smile, nodding as he accepted the book. He opened it to a fresh page, taking the pen the attendant offered him with steady hands. There was something dignified, almost ceremonial, about the way he held it, as though he'd done this many times before. The woman across the aisle exchanged a look with her partner, her eyebrows raised as if to say, "This isn't just anyone." The other passengers around them leaned in, trying to get a closer look, the realization dawning on their faces as they pieced together what this gesture implied. But no one looked more stunned than Laura sitting behind him. Her face had turned a shade paler, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing around as if hoping someone would explain, give her some clue about what was happening. Her mind raced, grappling with the uneasy realization that she may have misjudged him horribly. Tom finished writing in the book, capping the pen and handing it back to the flight attendant with a polite nod. She smiled warmly, her expression filled with admiration, and held the book to her chest like a treasured artifact. "Thank you so much, sir," she said softly. "It's truly an honor to have you on board." Tom inclined his head, acknowledging her words with quiet humility. The woman behind him swallowed, her face tight as she stared at him, her expression flickering between shock and disbelief. She could feel the weight of the other passengers' glances, their expressions a mixture of knowing sympathy for the man and quiet disdain for her. She leaned forward, her voice quieter, almost tentative. "I didn't catch your name," she said, a strained attempt at politeness in her tone. "You're clearly someone of importance. Are you in business?" The man turned to face her, his expression calm but unyielding. For a moment he considered her, as if weighing the need to respond. Finally, he gave a small nod, his voice steady. "Yes, I suppose you could say that," he replied. "I work in business among other things." She forced a smile, trying to salvage the situation. "Well, you could have said something earlier. I would have understood." The young woman across the aisle couldn't resist chiming in, her voice laced with incredulity. "Why should he have to? Respect shouldn't depend on who someone is." The words hung in the air, each syllable a quiet rebuke that made Laura's face flush with embarrassment. But Tom's gaze remained steady, his expression calm, but with an undeniable weight behind it. "She's right," he said quietly, addressing the woman directly. "Respect shouldn't depend on who someone is. But since you seem so interested—" He paused, allowing the words to sink in. "I'm a senior advisor to the United Nations. My work involves facilitating negotiations and promoting equality across international lines." The woman's face drained of color, her mouth opening slightly in stunned silence. A low murmur swept through the surrounding rows, passengers turning to one another with looks of amazement and disbelief. The young couple across the aisle exchanged knowing glances, their suspicions confirmed. He continued, his voice calm but pointed. "My team and I work to ensure fairness and equality are respected, values that transcend borders, race, and rank. It's work that requires humility and empathy, qualities that, as I'm sure you can appreciate, are vital in building a respectful world." Laura stared at him, speechless, her face a mixture of shock and humiliation. She struggled to find words, her mind racing as the enormity of her mistake washed over her. The authority in his voice, the calm command of his presence, it all suddenly made sense, and she realized, far too late, who she had been speaking to. "I didn't realize," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom's expression didn't change, but there was a quiet firmness in his voice as he cut her off. "Respect doesn't require prior knowledge, ma'am. It only requires a willingness to look beyond your assumptions." The young woman across the aisle smiled in quiet satisfaction, her gaze shifting from him to the woman, whose expression had turned from disbelief to a kind of desperate regret. Tom turned away, signaling the end of the conversation, his calm presence radiating through the cabin. The passengers around him sat in silent awe, some nodding in respect, others casting disdainful glances at the woman. She sat back in her seat, eyes downcast, her face burning with embarrassment. She could feel the weight of everyone's judgment pressing down on her, isolating her in a way that made her shoulders hunch, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The rest of the flight passed in relative silence. Passengers occasionally whispered to one another, some casting glances at Tom, others shaking their heads at the woman, their expressions a mixture of pity and disapproval. As the plane began its descent, the young woman across the aisle leaned over one last time, her voice soft but firm. "Maybe next time, you'll remember that respect is earned by how we treat others, not by who we think they are." The plane's wheels touched down with a smooth jolt, and the passengers exhaled a collective breath, the tension from earlier still lingering in the air. As the plane taxied to the gate, the flight attendants began their customary announcements, reminding everyone to remain seated until the aircraft had come to a full stop. Laura sat stiffly, her hands clasped tightly on her lap, her face pale. She didn't dare look around, aware that she was now the subject of silent scrutiny. Every whispered word and sideways glance seemed directed at her, each one like a spotlight exposing her behavior to those who'd witnessed it. Tom sat calmly by the window, his gaze unfocused as he looked out onto the tarmac, his expression serene. It was as if the earlier incident had left no mark on him. He exuded a kind of unshakable peace, an inner strength that made the passengers around him admire him even more. The seatbelt sign finally switched off, and people began standing up, retrieving their bags and stretching their legs. The young woman across the aisle cast one last look at the woman, her expression a mixture of pity and quiet satisfaction. Without a word, she shook her head slightly and turned away, reaching for her own bag. As passengers filed toward the front of the plane, Laura lingered in her seat, waiting until the aisle had mostly cleared. She fumbled for her carry-on, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled it from the overhead bin, her gaze still trained on the floor. She wanted nothing more than to disappear into the crowd, to slip away unnoticed, but she felt the weight of everyone's silent judgment as she moved down the aisle. When she reached the front, the captain and flight attendants were there, offering respectful farewells to each passenger. The flight attendant who had brought the book was still holding it close, and as the woman passed, she cast a single, unreadable glance her way, a brief moment that conveyed both professionalism and quiet disappointment. Finally, it was Tom's turn to disembark. He stood up, adjusting his jacket with a composed grace, and stepped into the aisle. As he approached the front of the plane, the captain extended his hand again, offering a genuine warm smile. "Thank you for flying with us, sir," the captain said, his voice filled with respect. "It's been a privilege." Tom accepted his handshake with a nod. "Thank you, Captain. The pleasure was mine." The flight attendants, too, offered smiles, their admiration clear as they watched him step onto the jet bridge. His quiet dignity left an impression on everyone who watched him, and as he disappeared from sight, there was a palpable sense of respect that lingered in the air, a lasting memory of his strength and restraint. As Laura stepped into the terminal, she glanced around nervously, pulling her bag closer as she tried to avoid the eyes of her fellow passengers. But the young woman who had spoken up on the plane was waiting nearby with her partner, their expressions calm but firm. They walked past her without a word, each casting a look that held a silent reprimand. Laura's cheeks flushed, and she turned quickly, hurrying toward the exit, her steps quick and unsteady. She could still feel the weight of her actions pressing down on her, a realization settling heavily in her mind. The whispers, the glances, the silent judgments, they all played back in her memory, each one a reminder of the respect she had forfeited. As she exited the terminal and walked toward the curb, she felt a new kind of silence settle over her, one that was cold and unyielding. For the first time, she understood that respect wasn't something she could demand or expect, it was something she had to earn. Meanwhile, Tom walked through the airport calmly, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips as he headed toward his waiting car. He could feel the difference he'd made, not by asserting his status or defending himself with words, but simply by holding on to his dignity, by showing others the strength that lay in kindness and self-restraint. As he stepped into the car, he glanced back at the terminal, a thoughtful expression in his eyes. He knew this wasn't the first time he'd encountered prejudice or misunderstanding, but he also knew that each encounter left a mark, a reminder to others of the quiet power that lay in respect, humility, and justice. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving behind the airport and the echoes of the day's events, and as he left, he carried with him the quiet certainty that his presence, his composure, had changed something in the people who had witnessed it. He knew that in the end, respect was something that couldn't be demanded or assumed. It was a choice made in the smallest of moments, in the way one treated others when no one else was looking. And that choice, he believed, was what held the power to change the world. So, what choices are you making to be part of that change? Let me know in the comments. and subscribe for more inspiring, untold life stories.